Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 220th presentation from CACOR on Zoom. The numbers are getting up there. Just a reminder, I'm going to be monitoring the chat during the presentation by our speaker, Geoff, who I'll introduce in a second. And so please put down your things in the chat and mark a Q in there if you can, if you have a definitive question, and we'll try to get to everybody. Geoff Strong, our speaker, is going to be talking to us about a practical way forward with the climate crisis. This is his third presentation on CACOR, and Geoff has moved right in. He's a member of the board now, and I'm part of the liaison with CMOS, the Canadian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society. And I'm very pleased that we've managed to entice a number of people with Met backgrounds into CACOR, and Geoff is certainly a leading light among those. His biography is on the slide, and I won't read it word for word. We just mentioned that Geoff does come from the meteorological background, and he's 50-year member with CMOS, the Canadian Met and Oceanographic Society. He's a fellow there. He's been president. He's been awarded, and he's done everything possible with CMOS. So since I'm with CMOS, it's obvious we'd connect sooner or later. He got his PhD in '85 and went to work in the Alberta Research Centre and the University of Alberta, mentoring students, doing research, and beavering away on still atmospheric sciences until after retirement, when in 2001 he narrowed his focus to climate change, and in the process eventually moved from Alberta to BC. And since then, he's been very active. It mentions a book in the biography. His latest book is going to be called Climate in Scripture, and I'm really looking forward to that one, because who knows, maybe we'll have the Noah's Ark and the flood and the parting of the seas, the Red Sea settled when this is published. But Geoff also has other books, Inconvenient Pipeline and Convenient Mistruths, in 2020 and 2017, respectively. So he's very well suited to comment further on the climate change crisis and what we're going to do about it. And so without further ado, I'd like to pass the scene over to Geoff.
Well, thank you, Bob, for your nice introduction, and good Trump morning to all of you today. The title of this presentation is A Practical Way Forward with the Climate Crisis. But before I go further, I wish to emphasize that pronoun in the title, a way, not the way. I'm not so naive as to think that my suggestion is the only potential solution, but it's simply the best way I know to fight this climate mess, while fully recognizing that any solution may already be too late. Now, my background photo here shows the sky meeting the sea. And clearly the horizon in this photo is dead straight. So we can now prove the flat earth theory on this Black Wednesday. So maybe, just maybe, climate change does not exist. But let's review the strongest indicator that believers have of global warming, which is the global average temperature anomalies. In this case, data from Berkeley Earth and the UK Hadley Centre, and they show that last year we exceeded the 1.5 degree level. That was agreed in Paris in 2015 as the level we should avoid. Indications to date suggest 2024 will exceed that record. So from there, I will briefly review. It's okay. A few climate disasters of 2024, starting with the Jasper Park fire that destroyed some iconic scenery in the park. And took out 1/3 of the town of Jasper. This fire could have been far more deadly than it was, if not for the quick action by the park fire chief in Parks Canada. Now the rough map here on the left, can you see my cursor, by the way? Maybe not, okay.
Yes, I can see your cursor.
Yeah. Oh, okay, so I can point things outward. Anyway, the rough map shows the town of Jasper, where it is, and the green star there. And I'll note that the major highway, the Yellowhead Highway, runs north and west from there. And the only other highway is the one that goes down through the park towards Banff Park. And the fires started, well, there was a little fire here, which closed down the route towards Edmonton. And the other fires, the major one, started down in here in this Athabasca Valley in the river. And of course, they followed up the valley and they accelerated northwestward rather rapidly. So that Parks Canada, under advisement from the park fire chief, decided to evacuate all Jasper Park campgrounds and the town of Jasper late the afternoon of July the 22nd. I heard of some criticism from members of Alberta government thinking that the park was jumping the gun too quickly. However, those routes north and south from Jasper were already closed because of the fires, so that their action probably saved many lives, for there were some 20,000 campers and plus 5,000 residents of Jasper ordered to move out on the only route left, and that was the route towards BC. Thankfully, that evacuation proceeded very orderly, as you see in this first photo there in the middle, with vehicles leaving Jasper and merging with campers coming from the south in two lines of traffic there, you see. And on the 22nd, no rush, no collisions, and no deaths from that, which is amazing. Because you can imagine how desperate people were. If Parks Canada hadn't started the evacuation early, a later fire closed the Yellowhead west, and everyone might have been trapped. So the second photo here shows the ferocity of the fire as it burnt through the town of Jasper on July the 24th. 4 firefighters did lose their lives fighting these fires. So we should mention the hurricanes that struck Florida, Helene and Milton, both of which ravaged Florida and the southeast U.S. this fall in preparation for Trump. And climate change didn't cause those storms, but certainly their intensity was caused by extremely warm sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico, greater than 30 degrees Celsius. Both storms were well forecast in terms of their intensity, track, and threat level, such as a predicted 20-foot surge along the coast of Florida, including the Panhandle. But Helene still resulted in over 300 deaths, mainly because human beings tend not to respond to threats until the disaster is on their very doorstep. And we see that same problem with the climate crisis threat as well. As it was hardly mentioned as an issue during the US election. Milton killed at least 25 and spawned a record 45 tornadoes in the northeast sector of the storm as it crossed over the central part of Florida. And damages from the 2 hurricanes were in the tens of billions of dollars. So folks, expect your insurance rates to go up all over the world, including Canada, in next year because of that. And last, I'd like to mention the most recent climate disaster, the heavy rainfall and flooding in southeast Spain on October the 30th, just last week, especially around Valencia. The event can certainly be at least partially attributed to climate change, and it brought to mind that old rhyme, the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. And my initial reaction was, no, that's not true. But then I reviewed the topography of Spain and realized the rhyme does apply. The plains region of Spain is actually just a narrow coastal strip along its east coast from Barcelona southwest to Valencia. And I deliberately mentioned Barcelona, which did not flood, because at that time we had 6 members, 3 generations of our immediate family, daughter and husband, grandson and his wife, and 2 of our great-granddaughters holidaying in Barcelona, and they had intended to drive down towards Valencia. And I panicked when I heard about Valencia's disaster on the 6 a.m. CBC radio news that morning, and it took a number of text messages to find out they were safe. So far, authorities have confirmed more than 200 deaths in Valencia, and it could be weeks before an accurate account is reached, especially in rural mountainous areas to the northwest, where there have been numerous mudslides inundating many areas where people live. And that's another reason why our insurance rates will go up, I suppose. Okay, so before I leave this topic of climate change impacts, I want to emphasize here that while the maximum global warming I put in an extra slide here because the 2024 hurricanes are not done yet. I understand that Hurricane Rafael, which is still just a Category 1 last evening, is supposedly headed across the Gulf of Mexico. And these sea surface temperatures still exceed 30 degrees Celsius, so we can expect some intensification after it leaves Cuba, I would think. And then it's indefinite where it's going to land beyond there at the moment. Okay, so before I leave this topic, I want to emphasize here that while the maximum global warming occurs in Arctic and mid-latitude regions, the very worst impacts of the climate crisis occur in the subtropics. Through here, tropics and subtropics. And these impact people who are least responsible for carbon emissions, as you see on here. That honor belongs to us in the mid-latitude industrial countries. Photo B here is just an example of climate refugees in northern Kenya, in the Dadaab, largest refugee camp in the world, I believe it is, lining up for cooking and washing water in a rather dubious water source. And then continue on with the subtropics. Graphic C here is just one example from the Yemen drought in 2021. That's just across the Horn of Africa in southern Arabia, of course. And a young boy here is suffering from famine, obviously. And the text mentioned he was not expected to live another 24 hours. And D just shows an example of, ocean acidification anyway, how the oceans absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, mixed with water, produces carbonic acid. And oceanography scientists that I know predict that virtually no corals or shellfish will survive beyond 2050. So here I'm going to diverge just for a few moments to return to Canadian wildfires and the subject of carbon emissions from wildfires, as this is highly relevant to my overall topic today. And in late August of 2023, there were claims made that the Canadian wildfires that year emitted enough carbon dioxide to equal or exceed total Canadian carbon emissions from all sources. And I contend that this was overstated and is therefore misinformation that one has to at least suspect originated from either the fossil fuel industry or big government as an attempt to deflect attention away from carbon emissions from burning fossil fuel. I haven't had a chance to obtain the data yet and check it out, but I'm almost certain that's the sense of it. And you'll notice in the Jasper Park wildfire here, the two leftmost photos, that even intense fires as they had there leave sporadic areas like here and up in there that are not completely burned over. While the second photo shows another Jasper burn area, which went through it quite intensely, where clearly most of the tree trunks remain, as in most forest fires. Approximately 50% of the dry weight of trees, including root systems, are carbon, but contained mostly in the trunks. Many fires just burn the canopy, as it happened in this case, and the smaller branches and any low-lying new trees. But likely, I'm not certain how, where am I? So the trunks are often left carbon scarred, but mostly intact. And I'm still not certain how overestimated the atmospheric carbon from 2023 was, but likely by at least a factor of 2, perhaps more. However, if the burned trunks are not harvested, a lot of the carbon eventually winds up in the atmosphere anyway through decomposition, released slowly over a couple of decades. In October of 2023, Phyllis and I carried out a survey of the infamous 2021 wildfire that burnt out the town of Lytton, BC, following the infamous heat dome that was over southern BC in late June of 2021. The town of Lytton and immediate area are shown before. You can see them here in the main part of the town, and after, where virtually every building in there was razed to the ground, nothing left. And as well, the kind of sparse trees that are on the left side of the road, because this is a dry area, are burnt out as well. The photo below shows logs from the Lytton fire piled up for use, likely either from wood burning furnaces or wood chips. And you can see standing trees still in the background there. Forestry companies could probably harvest these logs I contain, rather than clear cutting nearby untouched forest areas and thereby saving a carbon sink. Most trees remaining from burns are left to slowly rot and then releasing their carbon either back to the atmosphere or into the soils. Our climate crisis is a direct result of unlimited growth, exponential growth of population, of all industrial and farm products, and of the stock markets. And I learned this morning that the Dow Jones went up by 1,500 points, I believe. So get out there and sell all your fossil fuel investments, and you can probably buy renewables pretty cheap. And of course, of fossil fuel use, you see, as well as carbon emissions, all going up exponentially, all of them. And if I squeeze this one here like that, you'll notice the trend is virtually identical to global fossil fuel use. And emissions cause a similar trend in atmospheric carbon dioxide, of course. And I'll emphasize that the CO2 data that you see here on this last slide are almost certainly more accurate than emissions data, for they are peer-reviewed worldwide by thousands of scientists, whereas these don't get much of any peer review. But humans simply fail to realize that unlimited growth with limited resources is not sustainable, which leads us to this one, the global temperature anomalies. Again, is a little bit different than the one I showed you earlier. This one is from NASA mostly. But what I want to show here is that we see a similar growth in global mean temperature anomalies. And in recent years, emissions, atmospheric carbon dioxide, and global mean temperature increases have accelerated. And just this morning, I checked on the Mauna Loa daily CO2 data and find that CO2 is just about at 424 parts per million, 4 parts per million above its value exactly 1 year ago. The temperature anomalies show a quasi-linear increase, the broken green line, when you average them out. But starting from 2015 onwards, they appear to have increased in slope, although we don't have enough data yet to really confirm that, but that's what it's looking like. And at the Paris meeting, all 190 countries agreed to significant reductions in carbon emissions. Following 2015, carbon emissions, CO2, and global temperatures increased sharply. And in 2023, the world closed on 1.5 degrees warming. The previous slide from Hadley Center suggests it went over 1.5. Doesn't matter, because this year it's probably going to exceed even that value, and putting us beyond that level probably for good. So I ask then, how can we trust politicians in any country, and what are the risks that humans face? Well, that's partly answered by the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos in January of this year, where they identified 3 critical risks that we face from the climate crisis: extreme weather events, critical changes to Earth systems, and biodiversity loss. And let's examine those 3 risks. Extreme weather events refer to major winter storms, flooding events, tornadic thunderstorms, Category 4 or 5 hurricanes, all occurring more frequently and more in recent years. And these storms have a definable and predictable life cycle, and they normally, at least in the past, stayed in dynamic equilibrium, where the rate of increase was equal to the rate of decrease, rate of increase, and so on, until the storm decays and everything returns to about the same equilibrium. The second risk they defined, the critical changes to Earth systems, is far more serious because the main concern here is that the climate is at risk of reaching a tipping point where it would then undergo permanent changes. You see, now we're on an upward trend, and nature has to move it to a different level in order to restore equilibrium at some stage. That's the theory behind the metastable equilibrium. And certainly that happened with the an explosive volcano. Mount St. Helens, for example, was everything returned to equilibrium after it was over, but Mount St. Helens, the system, was changed forever, being about 500 or 600 meters lower in elevation. Atmospheric CO2 changes character during the 20th century from long-term dynamic instability. So you see these 8 cycles in 800,000 years, approximately 100,000 years in length. And I just have to move something that I can see, sorry. And unless there's a sudden reduction in carbon emissions to maybe 1950 to 60 levels in the next 15 years, which is highly unlikely now, we can probably expect mean global temperatures, the red, which follow the carbon dioxide, to jack up as well, because so far it's still been in dynamic equilibrium, but that may be about to change. Likely, according to climate models, after the 2°C warming level would be reached, which would be somewhere within a couple of years of 2040. That would set off rapid warming over a decade or two, with accompanying major weather disasters worldwide like humans have never experienced, in theory. And okay, note that atmospheric carbon dioxide that we view here, these data are cumulative. That's very important, and it's a fact that I don't believe that either fossil fuels or most government people actually realize, because they tend to think that if we stop all emissions today, then the carbon dioxide would fall down. But of course, that's not the case, because they have a long residence time in the atmosphere. So the third risk that they identified was biodiversity loss, which is declining rapidly, with almost a 70% decline in the populations of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, etc. since 1970. And even here locally, where when we first moved here a dozen years ago, anytime the sun shone, especially in the summertime, there were hundreds of birds outside my door, and there was a cacophony of sound. I like to leave my patio door open when I was working downstairs just to listen to it. And now I rarely see a bird around here. This is an example here of biodiversity loss during the 2021 heat dome over BC. In the Neches River on the central BC coast, tens of thousands of salmon, much more extensive than what you see in the photo here, were found dead after the Canada drought. And some unthinking people naively ask, why should we care if species go extinct? I would add a fourth climate risk, however, that the economic forum did not specifically identify, and I don't know why they didn't, and that's the health impacts of climate change. When fossil fuels are burned, of course, they release greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, being the primary ones which heat our climate. But more toxic pollutants, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and various oxides of nitrogen are also released. And these are not greenhouse gases, but they contribute to infectious diseases. For example, they likely set the stage for our deadly COVID outbreak. And they affect mental health, other infectious diseases, and various cancers and lung diseases such as asthma. And when wildfires break out, because of extremely dry forest conditions, they also release arsenic into air and water, as well as tiny PM2.5 particles. Various sources, including the World Health Organization, indicate that more than 8 million people die annually from fossil fuel pollutants. And if you think of these other disasters from the physical effects of climate change, we're looking at roughly on average about 500,000 people annually. So this is very important, and we should always be thinking of it, I think, and that's the health impacts. So in effect, we're now in a war against climate change and against fossil fuels, who wittingly or not are at war against nature. And we need to unite with nature to fight the climate crisis. But who knows what's going to happen now with Trump and probably Poilievre coming in the next year and denying climate change, of course. Whoops. So question, what is Canada doing to help fight the climate crisis? What's the plan, guys? So here are some important parts of Canada's climate plan. And I didn't pick all of them, just the ones that I prefer. These 5, plant 2 billion new trees. And initially that was a few million. And just a second, where am I? I keep losing my place there. I'll be okay in a bit. I guess I need a glass of water. But about 3 years ago, I addressed a letter to Prime Minister Trudeau explaining the fallacy of planting trees for the specific purpose of countering carbon emissions and also sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, as they had in the plan. In short, trees do not sequester measurable carbon before they're about 10 years old and do not reach maturity for at least 50 years, ruling them out for assisting in the federal climate plan. And then these others here, carbon tax, carbon pricing, cap and trade, we can probably lump them all under carbon pricing for simplicity. And then the infamous carbon capture and storage, CCS, which I'll address here shortly, because this is where the big lie lies. So the federal plan has one major flaw, and that is that all of these are focused on continued support for fossil fuels well past 2050, while they still claim to be reducing carbon emissions. And that's a contradiction which can't be justified, and it cannot work effectively at all. So these items, 1 to 5, won't do anything substantial to counter carbon emissions in the time we have left for action. That is, before the climate reaches a tipping point somewhere around 2040. An evaluation of these items are covered in the links that I show here, a couple of them, and there are a few others. This was in the Canadian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society bulletin back in May, and then the Hill Times newspaper in Ottawa, we published these two, that is with Richard Vanderjag and myself. And we've just published another one which deals with how we can't get contact with government even to motivate them. So consult those articles for the details. I will say more about carbon pricing and carbon capture and storage in a couple of minutes. First, there's one useful item I want to point out in the climate plan, that all new vehicles sold in Canada by 2035 must be full EVs. That's just simply practical sense. And I'm not going to go into the details about it, although Poilievre will probably wipe that one out too when he comes to power, because they passed a motion just a couple of days ago saying they basically don't believe in climate change, their party. I want to go on to carbon pricing. Industry and businesses are given a target maximum for carbon emissions. If they exceed their target, they can buy back carbon credit from someone downstream who takes responsibility for it. In other words, passing the buck. It doesn't change the emissions. And it includes the carbon tax and cap and trade, neither of which are worth my time to explain today. The federal government claimed an 8% reduction in emissions from 2018 here to 2020, from 725 down to 659 MT. A drop of, actually they said 8%, but it was actually 9% if you work it out. The government claimed this was positive proof that carbon pricing was working. What they didn't tell media and the public is that the drop was almost entirely due to COVID, when industry shutdowns in 2020 due to the COVID for 1 to 3 months, and they didn't get back to full operations before the following year, when emissions increased slowly, and then in 22 they increased even more so. So for 2021, they claimed a reduction of 9% for 2018 to 2020. And then they didn't want to admit to increasing emissions in 2022. So they said we've had a 6% reduction. Likewise, in 2022, they didn't want to admit to an even larger increase. So they said we've had a 2.5% reduction. And finally, apparently in 2023, there was a reduction in emissions according to Environment and Climate Change Canada, although I have some doubts about that number, but irrelevantly, they reported that the Canadian Climate Institute, which is just a government mouthpiece for the fossil fuels in government, because there was no competition for the jobs. They put people in who they wanted there, and they say what they're told to say. So they stated in the report in this past September, emissions were cut by 0.8% in 2023. We see policy starting to work. Well, in actual fact, there's a reduction of 5 MT there from 707. That's less than 0.1%, well within the range of errors for these data. So you can tell that I'm a little bit suspicious. The bottom line is carbon pricing is not working as they claim and is unlikely to result in any significant reduction in carbon emissions. Government is cherry picking their data, and that's deliberate deception, which in my book is not much better than a lie. And if you look at the global emissions in 2023, they actually increased by 1.3%. So I wonder about, that's why another reason why I wonder about Canada emissions. Cap and trade, we're not going to look at. Carbon capture and storage, CCS, quickly. There are 23 operational CCS facilities globally, mostly in the US and Canada. And over the years since 2008, there have been 20 to 30 of them. But they claim every year that hundreds more are under construction. I don't know where they are. They haven't come online. Most, if not all, are constructed primarily with government grants in the Canada and US, but they're owned outright and operated and reported by the fossil fuel industry with little or no government oversight. So there's 23 of these globally, and each year they claim hundreds more under construction. Most claim they can increase CCS, carbon capture and storage, to 1 million tons per year, but none have done so yet. And most pipe the liquefied CO2 away to pump beneath inefficient oil and gas wells. So the CO2 eventually finds its way back in the atmosphere. So they're not CCS, they're CCU, utilization of the carbon captured. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Assume they do capture 1 million tons per year, which they don't. And global emissions of 40 gigatons, which is 40 followed by 9 zeros, I'll remind you. So the number of CCS facilities required just to counter 10% of global carbon emissions. So they got to come up with some number. So let's give them 10%. It works out to 4,000 facilities they'd need just to do that, which is not a good use of government funds. So it's a waste of money, and yet our Canadian government still seems to promote it. So, how's my time, Bob?
It's looking good. It's only 2:10. I think you can coast along a little more, Geoff.
Okay. So what's this a way forward on the climate crisis? Um, and, but the other question that's not on here, of course, is it too late to attempt mitigation? An obvious way then is or was to use renewable clean energy, including solar, wind, geothermal, hydroelectricity, and even tidal and wave energy, although that one hasn't been well proven yet, such as the examples shown here. So all renewables all renewables source energy from the sun, directly or indirectly, and the energy is free. We just have to harness it and convert it to electricity, which is not a technical problem at all. No new technology development is necessary, and all have been in use for hundreds of years, except for the conversion to electricity. I have contended for many years that renewables could replace 90 to 95% of fossil fuels by 2040. They won't now because of politics. The first photo shows part of a solar farm that was developed in southern Alberta, the largest in Canada. And the companies involved were working independently with no government subsidies and doing quite fine in 2023 until fossil fuels got to Premier Smith, and she set conditions this past January that would rule out any more development. And last month made even tighter restrictions. She has simply prostituted Alberta to a single industry, which if it is not changed soon, they'll pay a huge price in the future, because the Fort McMurray oil is going to wind up being too expensive to produce. Now, some people complain that solar and wind farms are not aesthetically pleasing, and I wonder if they feel the same way about Fort McMurray oil sands. For anyone building a new home, it makes good sense to include a solar array and batteries for your home, and possibly to include a home-sized geothermal system and heat pump, especially if you have included a basement in planning. For adding an extra 6 to 8 foot trench at the same time as digging a basement makes good economic sense. Last, I'll mention, and I should mention here that the expert on this is Art Hunter, who has built his own network of renewables in this way. And you just cover it over after and grass it, of course. So last, I'll mention the possibility of adding small run-of-river hydroelectric turbines if you have a nearby river. That makes a good mix for added energy security. We do not want to be building any more large dams that destroy much of an environment and are costly and take years of planning and development. So an important question here is, how should a national policy on renewable energy proceed? A national policy. Well, the first thing is, given that fossil fuels are a huge international monopoly with virtually unlimited resources and finances, and would likely resist any major plan to replace fossil fuel energy, we need to be wary of that approaching tipping point in our climate, which could occur by 2040, after which the climate would warm more rapidly for a decade or two, and we could no longer reverse the process. Climate models suggest that greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere without any more added have the potential to warm the climate a further 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, producing disasters beyond anything the world has yet seen. And some, including James Hansen, have suggested as much as 10 degrees Celsius additional warming, except that takes us beyond our imagination, and humans could not possibly survive it. So we're now in a war against climate change and against fossil fuels. In any war, if a small army tries to battle head on with a much larger foe with more resources, they're easily defeated. And so if we do that with renewables, fossil fuels would simply wipe us out. They could not survive an open war with fossil fuels because they have far more money and power, more so than almost every government in the world. But in military battles, a smaller army can survive against a larger opponent by flanking them, moving around the back, and then they can attack from front and rear simultaneously. The classic successful case of this tactic, still studied by military experts, was how General Hannibal defeated a much larger Roman force in 215 BC. So could a flanking tactic be applied to defeat fossil fuels? In this case, it's best to ignore fossil fuels and start installing renewable mesogrids at local or municipal levels. And that would include microgrids for individuals on their own home. And these can be developed by small businesses or a municipality or a group of individuals developing a new residential subdivision, for example, or a new commercial venture, a hospital complex, schools, and so on. And once the region has enough of these mesogrids, I call them, they can be integrated together through the larger electric grid for increased energy security in what a meteorologist might call, I call it a subsynoptic scale grid. Some mesogrids could be town or even city size. And while doing this, businesses and industries need to be encouraged to go full electric for their energy needs, usually when major maintenance or renovations are necessary. And while individual homeowners with adequate finances can build their own microgrid of renewables and tie into the same electric grids. And as I mentioned already, within CACOR, we have a resident expert who has developed his own microgrid, Art Hunter. By creating a network of mesogrids within a region, you effectively flank fossil fuels because electric energy would then draw resources away from fossil fuels, reducing the demand for them. And market forces could then take over to direct reduced supplies of fossil fuels. This is opposite to the usual suggestion for reducing supply through reduced drilling permits or capping emissions. And even just this week, our federal government has is trying to pass a motion to cap emissions. But that's the wrong way around because it's you're trying to reduce supply to get at demand. In other words, this encourages everyone to think global and act local. And local economies stand to gain the most through this process and would readily sign on. At first glance, this suggestion for renewables to start at local scales may seem simplistic and unnecessary, but consider what happened in Alberta in 2023 following the development of several large wind and solar farms. The Alberta government, almost certainly under pressure from fossil fuel industries, first placed a moratorium on further development in August last year, followed up in January with rules so strict and ridiculous that no new projects were implemented, and last month even tightened up those restrictions. Renewable energy development in Alberta is effectively stopped for now. So what should be the roles of federal and provincial governments? What should they play? I think an important part of renewable energy projects is that while these need the involvement of the feds and provincial governments should stay at arm's length, allowing private enterprise to carry out the development. But we need government leadership to first stop all subsidies to fossil fuels and fully embrace renewable clean energy. Just an aside here, last year, apparently subsidies to fossil fuels amounted to $14 billion and to renewable clean energy, less than $1 billion. So that should be reversed. And provide subsidies to small businesses or public groups developing mesogrids. To work with provincial governments to upgrade major electric grids, because those are a provincial responsibility, and make them west-east instead of the usual north-south into the US. We need to encourage industries, as I said, to convert to electricity from fossil fuels is much cheaper with less maintenance, so it's an obvious one. And ensure cross-training courses be arranged for workers switching from fossil fuel jobs into renewables. There are other advantages mesogrids of renewables. Each one can be operated independently, with its own battery storage or linked with others for security. And it's triflingly easy to expand the mesogrid, simply adding more solar panels or wind profilers with no disruption in energy. With mesogrids, less energy loss over small distances, depending on the voltage involved, high voltage, less loss, and using direct current rather than alternating current. But that gets me into areas that I don't even understand, so I'll shut up there. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this this slide here and go towards the end here. Just mention a few additional problems, and that is the momentum of fossil fuels, their intent on profit making, sweeping all else aside. The inertia of governments, frozen in their thinking, stuck with mitigation tactics that support fossil fuels through 2050, and still thinking they're reducing carbon emissions, which they aren't in any useful way. And our latest Ottawa Hill Times story that Richard and I published here this Monday is given here, the link for it, in which we complain about this inability, our inability to oh, sorry, I got the wrong story on there. Anyway, you can go on Hill Times and find it. Just search for strong and jagged. I want to wrap up here, Bob here, but so a fourth problem is well, the third problem: small renewable developers are sometimes barred by fossil fuel governments blind to the climate crisis and narrow thinking, specifically in Alberta and now in the U.S. Climate and medical scientists face this impenetrable wall trying to advocate government to change. That's the other opinion editorial that I wanted to mention there. So it's inertia and momentum that sank the Titanic, and the climate crisis threatens to sink all of civilization if we don't turn aside. And just to summarize, and I won't summarize that, I'll just go to a favorite quote of mine from the great Greek philosopher Socrates, who in 450 BC said, "The secret to change is to focus all of your energy, not by fighting the old, in this case fossil fuels, but on building the new, in this case renewables." And finally, to those who think Canada is probably the safest country in the world from climate change, that thought may be correct. But like the chaps in the bow of this boat here, who say, "Sure, glad the hole isn't at our end." We're all in the same boat, and with the climate, we're all on the same planet. So again, think global, act local. And I'll drop it there. Over to you, Bob.
Right. Thank you very much, Geoff. A most interesting presentation, adding on to some of the stuff you've given us in fairly recent previous ones. We have some stuff in the chat, and some of them are comments and questions, and they're mainly from Richard Vandergat and the good long comment by Charles Hall. So once I give you my little question, I'm going to bring Richard on, and Charles Hall will be on deck, and then after that, John Legg. Anyway, my only comment was I was asked to mention the Hill Times article, but I see you covered it just at the end of your presentation, so that's good. My question, basically, you say we're in a war with climate change, and all hands have to be on deck and to do anything, and that's all good. The only thing is, elsewhere in your presentation, you also said that the accumulated CO2 in the atmosphere is already so severe and so much that we're going to go at or through these tipping points, regardless if we even win the war or the first battle, let alone who's going to be in the war besides us. So I wondered if you had a comment on that.
Yeah, well, like I said, we have 15 years or so to do this for renewables. We can go back 20 years. We had 30 or 40 years to do this, and we still haven't done a damn thing. We have 15 years left. There's always hope. So we should be trying to do that. And I guess some people are, but they're held back by government and fossil fuels.
For sure. Okay, let's go to Charles Hall. I'm sorry, let's go to Richard Vanderjagt first and then Charles Hall on deck. Richard had a question. Do you want me to read that question, Richard, or do you
No,
want
it's
to
okay.
come on?
I'll go ahead and ask it.
Perfect.
So thank you. So Geoff and I, as you know, we've published quite a number of articles, Hill Times, National Observer, and we think very much alike. But I've always wanted to know, let's assume that we can educate the Parliament. That's a huge assumption. And that we can educate the public, but again, a huge assumption. What would be the most optimistic transition we could, complete transition from fossil fuels to renewables, like in terms of timelines? If we were to say we could do this in the next X number of years, how many years do you think it would take?
If you go back to the slide I skipped over, it mentioned a few other countries that are involved.
Well, go back to
They
that
are
slide.
doing
I
it.
wanted you to show that, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good
I
idea.
have to skip it. But anyway, I've said all along, and I've been saying this for at least 10 years, we could easily replace 50% of fossil fuels by 2030 and 90 to 95% by 2040.
Oh, perfect.
Still the problem of what we got up in the atmosphere there, right? We got to be
Yeah,
working
that's right.
on that. And we have no technology which can draw down carbon dioxide significantly. The best we have are trees, but leave it to trees, it will take several centuries to draw down, enough carbon dioxide to make a difference. So we got problems.
Yeah, well, actually, what you need to do is give a talk to Parliament. But somehow we need to get you in front of Parliament and give them a talk and educate them both. But
I've tried. I've written 4 letters to the PMO and copies to all MPs in the last 3 years, and I get very few responses. Just ones from their secretaries, which say, "Oh, we're doing everything we can," and they don't answer.
try the Speaker of the House. Try the Speaker of the House.
My own MP, Alistair McGregor, is much more open to it, and he does chair the NDP caucus. So there's some hope of getting something in there, but we know that Conservatives are probably going to take over next year, so I don't know what use.
Yeah, Hill Times this morning, they got record amount of funding in the last quarter.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't want to depress people more than they already are after last night's election.
People just don't realize how serious climate change is.
Oh God, yes, I know. Well, that was well spoken, Geoff. Well done.
Our next comment is from possibly John Legg, and Dave Doherty will be on deck. John?
Mute. Okay. I'll just read it off, Geoff.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of an unknown subject, and it has to do with the new Trump government. So what do we think? What do you think that a new Trump government is likely to do in terms of greenhouse gas emissions over a 4-year term? Sort of
one word, nothing.
Well, okay. So then the host is asking you to start the video. All right. Okay. So Canada could not fully compensate for the increase in emissions, but do you have any suggestions as to what we could do? And it's presumably as much of a diplomatic thing than anything else. It's going to be difficult to deal with the Trump government in any case. We don't want to make our life even more difficult. However, someone's got to do the work, and you pointed out very well that we're not doing much. So anyway, whatever you have and any comments as to the future coming up. And
that's a really good question, John. And Mostly it's as I said, the inertia of the federal government right now, that they continue to come up with things that continue to support fossil fuels indefinitely. And that's wrong, right? They need to switch their support to renewable energy. It's the only option we have at the moment that I can see, unless you think of nuclear or something like that. But I don't go near that one because of the safety issues involved in that. So I don't know. And of course, if the Liberals are going to lose the next election, which if Trudeau had resigned and they'd found a better, stronger leader and combined with the NDP, they could still make a reasonable change, and that would be a message to the rest of the world, and particularly to the U.S. You know, if we showed real success in reducing emissions, not this penny ante stuff that they're showing with their deceptions to date. I couldn't answer any more than that, I don't think, John.
Well, it's a good stab, and there's going to be a lot of unknowns in the next little while. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you.
Welcome.
Charlie Hall had a fairly long question here. Charlie, do you want to read that one off? And then we'll have Dave Doherty.
I'm not sure which question you're referring to, because I don't think I
Well,
submitted one. But I
do
do
you
have
have-
a question, Geoff.
It's the albedo,
which
the one
is,
with the albedo.
yeah, albedo. Have you heard this? Some argue that I'm concerned because water vapor is 4 or 5 times more powerful than CO2. And yet all this blame goes on CO2, which I'm not denying. I'm not in any sense a climate denier, but I'm trying to figure things out a little bit more. And I'll probably try to find it and send it on and see if I can get it to you, an article that made a pretty good argument for change in albedo as being a climate change driver. Do you have any knowledge or information on that?
Well, yeah. Carbon dioxide hasn't been a major concern up till now. It's mainly responsible for having kept the climate stable for millions of years. But all of a sudden, we're looking at 1 and even 1.5 degrees of warming, and the amount of vapor in the air is directly proportional to the temperature, nothing else. And that increases.
But why doesn't that drive a positive feedback loop?
Well, it does. So yeah, because water vapor with that 1.5 degrees temperature increase, I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but it increases water vapor in the atmosphere over the whole globe by roughly by between 10 and 15% anyway. And of course, that contributes to more warming, right? Because like you said, it's also a greenhouse gas, which
and when that
increases the warming,
more
that
water
increases
vapor
more
in the
water
air
vapor. That's the positive feedback, and you're in an endless cycle then. So
I don't see any substantial scientific assessments of that.
well, there have been various assessments, and I've given a couple of myself, but that has to be balanced against the albedo. You mentioned albedo because the more clouds you put in the air, the more is reflected back to space. But I think overall is contributing a positive feedback to global warming, which increases the amount of water vapor again, which increases the amount of warming, and so on. I'll try and direct you to a paper or two on that later. You'll need to send me your email.
I've given something already to you via Art, so that should work.
Okay. And Dave,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody, our next, we have two more coming for sure. We have Dave Doherty and a new question in from Claude Boutner, who should be on deck after Dave. Dave?
Thanks very much, Bob. Great presentation, Geoff. I made the observation early on that it would be appropriate to say welcome to the Pyrocene. I would like to ask you, though, to what extent will switching to renewable energy systems worsen our ecological overshoot?
Excellent question. It will to start, but think if there is no renewable energy development, then fossil fuels will do that overshoot anyway. And it's more or less temporary because once we get, if we got renewable energy in place, then they're much longer lasting with less maintenance. Plus, I'm told by various sources that all renewables are up to 95% recyclable. And if we get into that mode, then you're not using so much of the Earth's resources. But there's no way around this without using more resources. There's just no way. So as far as how much, I don't know. But
so it makes something I read just this morning potentially very relevant, which is a new term. Instead of a polycrisis, it looks like we may well be headed for a permacrisis to the extent that we're going to survive as a species.
Could be. We don't deserve to be on this earth anyway.
Well, thanks very much.
Thanks, Dave. Our next next person up is Claude Boutner, and followed by a question by John Hollins. So, John, you're on deck, and Claude.
Okay, so Geoff, thank you for that last comment, because most people won't touch that comment. But a species that destroys a planet, one wonders, is that part of the Great Plan? And if so, perhaps the sooner they're flushed, the better, or at least their civilization, if not the species itself. That we'll save those questions for another day. My comment actually was to say that 2.5 years ago, McKinsey and Company, a multinational consulting firm, so everything they say you should take with a grain of salt, but I found them very forthcoming in a report that is still free and available for download at that link that I put in the chat. And they have an executive summary and also a very long report. And they talk about scenarios, and I actually discovered them in reverse order from COVID, Zooms to, where did they get these scenarios? Well, they got them from a banker's, the Network for Greening Financial Systems, all the bank directors and or national banks across the world that have been working on this since about 2016. And they, in turn, have been working with some modelers, economic and climate modelers. And behind me, you might see a graphic that includes too little, too late in the upper right-hand corner. And I believe that William Rees has said that's actually the path we're on. We collectively think that, oh, look at all those turbines, look at all that solar, look at all the money I personally have invested in insulation, et cetera. And I wash out my jars before I put them in the recycling. And yet it's not enough. And we are headed to a disorderly transition, which is another name for collapse or unraveling. So it's about an hour presentation. I saw several of them, and this is one of the best that is actually still linked on that page, even though one would ask, geez, if they want people to invest in an economy, they certainly aren't certain. And they even talk about, is this even possible to hit net zero 50? You might have suspicions that it's just something to kick the can down the road, but they were actually saying, is it even possible? Because it would require 8 to 9% of global GDP every year to be spent from 2022 to 2050. This goes in the trillions of dollars. And of course, we haven't really started, have we? 2.5 years after that report came out. So that's a very lengthy description, and I'll have you elaborate on your comment about we don't deserve to be here.
Yeah, I haven't seen that link, but I'll certainly look at it later today, probably. But most of these things that come out from the banks and fossil fuels, they work together, of course, as you know, and most of them are designed to deflect attention away from the fossil fuel problem. I want to give you an example that was on the slide that I missed there. Europe, the European Union, they expect to be carbon neutral or close to it by 2050, and they're well on track to doing that. And they've estimated the cost at $5.3 billion, so that's a lot of the GDP. But I also read 2 days ago that fossil fuel profits are running more than 5 billion, I shouldn't say billion, trillion, are running more than $5 trillion per year. So where's the GDP going then? It's into fossil fuels. And why not turn that around again into renewables? And the benefit, of course, the added benefit is of course, much cleaner air and reduced climate warming. I believe this is all part of the greening that banks and who are the biggest supporters of fossil fuels and fossil fuels together are always coming up with these things. I mean, just like you hear about, oh, EVs exploding all the time in fires, and we don't have enough storage capability for the electricity required. It's all BS, right? Those are technical problems that have already been looked after. So I have my doubts about that, but I will have a look at it and get back to you. I don't.
Very good.
Thanks,
Thank
Geoff.
you for that summary.
Yes, very good. I see our time is winding down. We have two more people, and John Hollins, I'd like to ask you to please wait because one of our spotters noticed Ed Lazowski's hand had been raised. I missed that. So Ed Lazowski, if you're ready to ask yours, then John Hollins will follow. Ed?
Thanks, Bob. I'm Ed Lazowski, and I'll try and be quick. You know I'm naive, Geoff, so I have a naive idea, and that is, could the new government in the US be an opportunity in the sense that politically they do not seem to believe in big government? Trump is in cahoots with Elon Musk. Musk is apparently being designated, possibly, as the new czar of efficiency. And what's more efficient than getting big government out of solving problems and getting the problems into the hands of small people? Now, whether or not they actually believe that is another matter. But if you could somehow take advantage of that opportunity, and you seem to be ideally situated for that in the sense that you've written popular books explaining this. This lecture is very good for our level of understanding, but maybe something that's more directed towards teenagers, because I see their voters as perhaps being more at that level. And I just wondered if somehow you couldn't take advantage of this. I'm not sure how, Geoff. That's just a question.
Yeah, our youth are the most important of this because after all, they're the ones that are going to be most affected. I just wanted to mention that Ed Lazowski, who was my supervisor, both my graduate degrees, I whizzed through the defense in both cases, except Ed always asked the most difficult questions, which would stump me. And that one stumps me a little bit, but yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that.
Maybe we could just confer later, Geoff. I'll send you a few thoughts and we'll maybe take it further.
This is good.
Okay, John Hollins, you had a question.
And Bob, I'd like to share one slide if that's okay with you. I've heard. Sorry, Geoff, you paint a dismal picture of where Canada's emissions have come from
Mhm.
relation to where they're going. I don't think you're nearly dismal enough. So let me show you a picture. If I can find it. Yeah, here we go. Share. So have you got this picture?
Yep, I see it.
Okay, look, the first thing I want to say is that Canada has been declaring its emissions reductions from 2005. All right,
Yeah.
here's 2005, just there. You see my arrow? All
Yeah.
right? It
Yeah.
was 740, something like that.
Yeah.
Somebody circulated on CACOR Climate Google a report from the European Union recently, where most of the countries have secured significant reductions, but they don't use 2005 as the baseline.
No.
They use
1990. Yeah.
1992. Why? Because that's the year that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted. Mulroney was the first to sign that on behalf of Canada. That, of course, turned out to be the easy part. But I want you to come back to, I'm picking a nit in a sense. Geoff, you put up a figure for 2023 and said it was from the government of Canada. It was not. You will remember that it takes our wonderful government of Canada, and this isn't the prime minister or the ministers, this is the machinery of the departments. It takes them 16 months from the end of a calendar year to publish their calculation. So you publish from a commercial source, which is almost certain, and it's irrelevant, even if it's wrong by a couple, not right on the dot. It really doesn't matter, because look, there's where we were in 2022. It's probably the source you said says hadn't changed significantly in 2023. But where are we going? This was the target that Canada adopted in Paris in 2015. Our parliament, all four of our political parties in the election campaign in 2021 adopted stiffer targets than that. The Liberals adapted, our current government aimed for 450 in round numbers. Now, if you see, that would take, this was the financial disaster of 2008. All right, I call it. Here's what the pandemic did. How many pandemics would it take to get from here to here, which is the Liberal target? The Conservatives stuck with that target in that last election campaign. The Green Party wanted to come way down here. Our politicians there's no substance to the work of our Canadian Parliament. I'm not surprised, and I'm not really blaming them, because I reckon that the most difficult job in Canada is not running some big corporation like Enbridge. It's being Prime Minister and responsible for a huge raft of issues to deal with. So I'm not, and the people in Parliament, we put them there. So if we don't like what they do, we're about 20, 30 years late in doing something about it. So all I want to say, Geoff, is you please keep on doing what you're doing and hit them harder.
Well, they're not going to make that target, I can tell you that. Not with the present plan. And part of the problem, I'll just go back to the amount of atmospheric carbon that's in the air. that most fossil fuel people, this is my opinion, and most of the most government MPs believe that if we're at 420 parts per million, they believe that that's, if they stopped emissions, that would suddenly drop. And that's not the case. They don't realize that the warming we experience in any given year, let's say this year, 2024, is not due to emissions in 2024. It's the cumulative emissions for the last 100 years. And that's what I think they don't get. So that just stopping emissions alone isn't going to help us.
You brought that issue. You drew this to our attention. I mean, I think some of us knew already, but this, I've since you made that point, I presume in an email, I've been making it with like the Blackburn Hamlet Gentlemen's Gossip Group breakfast this morning.
Yeah.
That's my wife's name for a bunch of retired guys who have a breakfast every week on Wednesday mornings. And I'm not sure they understood what I said, but I think 2 or 3 out of the 10 probably did. And so thank you for reinforcing that point, Geoff.
Mm.
Okay, everybody, it's closing on 3, but Art Hunter has made a comment about the Ontario OEB and the IESO and their business about Ontario renewables. So let's let Art have a go at that one, and then we'll see if we have any time for any more. We're pretty well out here. Go ahead, Art.
Yeah, I just think it's worthwhile mentioning that yesterday I spent my morning with a member from the Ontario Energy Board. This was a live meeting from the Independent Electricity System Operator for Ontario. They're the grid managers, and a local distribution company being Hydro Ottawa. And they were all addressing the electrical transition and going off fossil fuels. And of course, this is a major problem, even though Ontario is primarily nuclear, got a lot of nuclear support and hydro, because in fact the prediction is that the demand for electricity is going to grow by 75% between now and 2050. So this means that there has to be a lot of renewable energy brought on stream to match the growth. So as the growth is going up in terms of the demand, the growth has to follow in the supply. And it was quite an interesting conversation. One of the things that, for those who don't fully understand, the OEB, the Ontario Energy Board, report to the Minister of Energy in Ontario, but they set all energy policy for both electricity, natural gas, so as well as pricing policies, etc. They're very, I had a good conversation with them with regards to the setting of the rate structure for electricity and how that, in fact, with the ultra low overnight rate, really can encourage industry and homeowners and what have you to in fact give serious consideration to putting solar and battery pairing on their respective buildings that they all own, and to have variable rates, targeted at specific sectors of society, to encourage industries, and this includes these AI servers, which we hear so much about, and as well as EVs and heat pumps, to try and time shift their loads to night and off the peak times. Anyway, I think that the only thing that I can say for sure is that in Ontario we've got the government and all the bureaucrats online that are trying to address the problem. I think what Geoff has said here is Alberta's going the other way. And I don't think they've adequately addressed the growth that's going to be happening there, or at least the only way that they'll be able to address it is by bringing more fossil fuel turbines online. I'm not sure what's happening in BC and Prince Edward Island, etc. I don't know what's happening across the country in this regard. But I think we're in for some major problems between now and 2050, and renewables have to be brought on at an enormous rate. So everything you just said, Geoff, I fully support. I think it's in the hands of our politicians, and they haven't really shown any real stomach for doing anything meaningful. Anyway, that's my comment.
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that Ontario is now supporting renewables more, but they're also supporting opening up more nuclear and opening up more LNG. And the whole problem with this is that they have to go 100% on renewables or we're done.
Yeah.
And no government is doing that except maybe in Europe.
Okay, and I agree with that. And David Doherty, can you put the end slide up and thank the speaker?
You bet. So fascinating, Geoff. I love it when people marshal facts. It really matters. Sadly, I think there are far too few people who actually are paying much attention to the facts. And I hope the next 4 years isn't going to prove that south of the border, let alone here. At any rate, I think this is an excellent video. I hope everybody will consider sharing it with family and friends. Anybody who sees this on the internet, you're welcome to come to our website. All of our previous recordings are there and on YouTube. You can see a great deal of information, almost all of it very factually based. If you would like to become a subscriber, please do. You're also welcome to join us. I think we probably ought to say proudly, we are no longer on X. But if you would like to engage with us, we'd love to see you back. Thanks again.